Let me add my own welcome to all of you. I'm so happy to see all of you here, especially with weather like this. Not only was the invasion of Iraq sold to us and justified by a web of lies, the entire progression of this very brutal occupation, shamefully including torture and so many deaths, has been shrouded in deceit. We don't see any pictures of the dead and the dying. We don't see pictures of the wounded, the funerals, or even the rage and anguish of the returning soldiers from Iraq. And above all, we never hear the other side. We never hear about the casualties, the oppression, the suffering, and the thousands killed in Iraq. And the mainstream media has really colluded with the government to sanitize this version of this occupation. And independent, unembedded journalist Dahr Jamail has done what is humanly possible to make a difference in this. In 2003, Dahr Jamail was just as frustrated as the rest of us at the very little news that was coming out of Iraq. And he, I think, in his own words, had a choice. He could sit at home and be frustrated and angry, or he could take action. And so what Dahr Jamail did is he bought himself a laptop computer, a digital camera, and a plane ticket. Dahr Jamail traveled to Iraq at his own expense and on his own steam to become a witness on behalf of the Iraqis. His brilliant, moving accounts of the invasion and of the impact that has had on the people in Iraq has become nothing less than monuments to truth in a sea of lies. And in all these 5 years, many of us have relied very much on Dahr Jamail to give us the kind of news that we weren't able to get from any other source. Dahr Jamail writes for the Interpress service. His stories have been picked up by The Guardian, The Nation, The Independent, and Le Monde Diplomatique, among others. He also reports on Democracy Now! On BBC, and he's been interviewed on National Public Radio. Dahr Jamail has received numerous awards, including the prestigious Martha Gellhorn Award for Journalism in 2008. We are so delighted and so proud to be able to hear Dahr Jamail tonight and to honor him. He's here fresh from Baghdad to share what is really happening on the ground in Iraq today and to give a human face to the suffering that's going on there. I would like to call on Ian Lavalle, who is with Iraq Veterans Against the War, to say a few words and then bring on Dahr Jamail. Thank you.
I guess most of the introduction that I'd want to hear has been already said, and I guess I feel that the things that I've learned from reading things that Dahr has written and brings me back to my experiences, and it brings me to a place that I think so many Americans need to be cognizant of what's going on there. Not just as Americans, and things that are happening in our tax dollars and in the name of our Constitution or with our family members, but as human beings and the true cost of it all. So, thank you.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks to Iraq Veterans Against the War. I too want to thank all of the sponsors tonight. There are so many. The two I will name singly, near and dear to my heart. My publisher, Haymarket Books, thanks to them. I actually had a publisher for my book after a lot of work trying to find one. The ISO, and another thank you to Iraq Veterans Against the War. briefly, Iraq Veterans Against the War and folks like Ian who are resisting, who have come out of the military apparatus and who are resisting it, lessons from Vietnam show us very clearly that if and when there will be a true end to both of these occupations, it's not going to happen without a very large, well-organized, powerful GI resistance movement that has massive support from people back home here. And I think that's an important thing for all of us to keep in mind as this occupation continues. And I'm going to get, go ahead. I'll get a bit more into that later. Since I did just get out of Baghdad a couple of weeks ago from my fifth trip over there, I want to talk about that mostly tonight, at least during my speech. I want to start, I actually recently gave a talk down in Houston at a place called the Rothko Chapel, named after an amazing artist named Mark Rothko. And if any of you are down in downtown Houston, I would highly recommend you go to this place. There are actually some rough similarities to the Unitarian Church. In fact, one quote that's said about the Rothko Chapel down there is, "This is a place where action takes the form of supporting human rights, and thus the chapel has become a rallying place for all people concerned with peace, freedom, and social justice throughout the world." And so that you'll get at least a flavor of the man behind the art, and you have to see the art yourself. But Mark Rothko, I want to include some of his quotes because I think they're really pertinent, especially to the times that we're in right now. And his one quote that I'd like to lead with from Rothko, the painter, he said, quote, "The role of the artist, of course, has always been that of image maker. Different times require different images. Today, when our aspirations have been reduced to a desperate attempt to escape from evil, and times are out of joint, our obsessive subterranean and pictographic images are the expression of the neurosis, which is our reality. To my mind, certain so-called abstraction is not abstraction at all. On the contrary, it is the realism of our time." I feel that that applies now, and especially during the time of the lead up to the invasion of Iraq. We're coming up on the 6-year anniversary of the invasion, March 19, 2003. 6 years. When we all remember all too well the weapons of mass destruction, to talk about the surrealism of our time, the weapons of mass destruction, the links between Saddam Hussein and the events of September 11th, and perhaps the most preposterous justification for the war, that given of the liberation of the people of Iraq. I think it's really important, as it was then, which is one thing that I think lit a big enough fire under me to do something as crazy at the time as going to Iraq in the first place, to start writing about it. But even now, when we hear talk about withdrawal except for 50,000 troops, withdrawal except for an embassy the size of the Vatican City, withdrawal except for 4 enduring bases, some of the biggest U.S. military bases anywhere on the planet. Withdrawal. Let's not allow our intelligence now, just as was necessary when the invasion was launched, to be insulted by feeling compelled to respond to anyone who continues to assault us with this level of propaganda that invading Iraq had anything to do with bringing democracy to the people of Iraq. It's not even original. All empires throughout history have used this excuse for invading and plundering new lands. I'll come back to this. I went into Baghdad this trip. It was my first time back in 4 years. All of my first 4 trips were in a fairly concentrated period between roughly the end of 2003 and the beginning of 2005. And the last time I was in there was February 2005. And when I went back in this January 2009, I had, of course, been following the situation really, really closely. I had Iraqi contacts in there on the ground. I was reading the news daily from different outlets and had a pretty good idea of what was happening politically. Heat. Politically, as well as, you know, what was the situation with the infrastructure on the ground and such. So I went into it knowing that things were not going to be good. I knew that Iraqi people were struggling, unemployment was horrible, there was big infrastructure problems, but living in this country, it's almost impossible to escape the kind of insidious nature of the propaganda. Well, the surge worked, and violence is down. Things are better, aren't they? And I think because of those reasons, as well as I think a part of me that wanted to believe at least somehow something had gotten a little bit better since my last visit there 4 years ago, I went in expecting to find something better, anything better. I would happily report that. But what I can say, the one thing that was relatively better, as I mentioned, was overall violence had dropped. And let's qualify this, because overall violence dropping means instead of, say, compared to a year and a half ago, where we had between 1 and 300 Iraqis every single day being killed, now the number is somewhere between about 5 and 3 dozen. The month I was there, almost every single day there was a car bomb somewhere in Baghdad. Almost every single day there were clashes somewhere in Baghdad. I stayed in a hotel about 4 or 5 blocks from one of the edges of the so-called green zone, and almost every single day that the green zone was being mortared. That's better security. On every other level, everything was worse. Infrastructure, electricity was worse. There was an average of about 2 to 4 hours every 24-hour period anywhere in Baghdad. Outside of Baghdad, it's worse. It's about 2 hours of electricity per 24-hour period. I was privileged enough to get to stay in a hotel, so we had a generator, which was, of course, running almost nonstop. We had running water. We had hot water. Unlike about 45% of Iraqis, according to the World Health Organization, that don't have access to clean drinking water. Unemployment, we all know that we're in an economic crisis in this country. Unemployment, official figures just went up to 8.1%. In the Great Depression here, it was roughly 29%. We all know of the stories, at least, of how horrible that was. In Iraq, unemployment ranges between 50 and 70%. It's staggering to go around Baghdad and see people begging, entire families begging. 1 out of 4 people in Baghdad, a capital city with 6 million people, are displaced from their homes. The level of suffering that first week I was there, it knocked me on my heels, and I don't know that I ever really recovered, because I expected to find some tangible evidence of at least something getting a little bit better. And if you want to call, as I described, improved security as an improvement, well, there's that. But beyond that, there was just nothing to find. But again, I want to get into some of the machinations that are the occupation today, and then a little historical context, and I think that will kind of clarify why I shouldn't be surprised that, of course, things aren't better, and why I think neither should you. Again, let me just run through some broad brushstrokes to remind everyone of the situation there. As we near the 6-month anniversary of the invasion, the 2 most recent surveys we have of the number of casualties, which I think is always the most important statistic we can talk about regarding Iraq. So casualties directly related to the invasion and occupation, one by a group called Just Foreign Policy in the U.S., one by the OMB research group over in Oxford in the U.K., estimate between 1.2 and 1.4 million Iraqis have died as a direct result of the invasion and occupation. Between 1.2 and 1.4 million people out of a country with 26 million total population. Displaced, as we speak, 1 out of every 6 Iraqis are displaced from their homes. We have approximately 5 million people, about roughly half of which have fled the country altogether, half of which are displaced within Iraq. And in addition to that, we have, according to an Oxfam International report that came out about a year ago, and this continues to this day, approximately 8 million people in dire need of emergency assistance, which means people that if they don't get access to medical attention when necessary, food, clean water, and shelter, they're literally at risk for their lives. And again, when we consider the staggering number of people who are displaced, this really puts this into a very real context. And when we add all those numbers up, 8 million in need of emergency assistance, approximately 5 million people displaced from their homes, and over 1 million dead now, that means over half the total population of the country of Iraq are either in need of emergency assistance, displaced from their homes, or dead as we near the 6-year anniversary of the invasion. This is apocalyptic. I mean, of an entire country, we're talking about over half the people, this is the situation that they're in. But again, when you look at the media, all the 3 big national broadcast TV networks in this country pulled out all their full-time correspondents as of this past December. There's basically no journalists in Iraq now because the economy is the story or something else. But it's not Iraq because basically, you know, unless you have 300 people die in a day, it's just not going to make the headlines. But I want to shift gears now and talk about the current situation regarding some of the things the U.S. has done to dampen down the violence to the level that it is now. And I want to give context because I'm going to focus in on Fallujah. I went and spent a few days in Fallujah on this recent trip. So it was about 3 weeks ago I was in Fallujah. And I want to talk about the awakening groups. These were touted so highly by the Bush administration, and they continue to be a big player in Iraq today. But for context for that, and you'll understand why I'm going to do this in a minute, I want to read a few pages from my book about when I went into Fallujah during the April 2004 siege of that city, the first U.S. military attack against that city. And I went in because we were hearing horrible stories of things that were happening at the hands of the military in there. And I got a chance to go in on a kind of a rickety old bus carrying humanitarian supplies with a couple of activists and a couple of Iraqi journalists. We rolled toward the one small clinic where we were to deliver our medical supplies. The clinic was managed by Maki al-Nizal, who had been hired just 4 days prior. He was not a doctor. The other makeshift clinic in Fallujah was in a mechanic's garage. Nizal had barely slept in the past week, nor had any of the doctors at the clinic. Originally it had just 3 doctors, but since the U.S. military bombed one of the hospitals and were currently sniping at people as they attempted to enter or exit the main hospital, effectively there were only these 2 small clinics treating the entire city of Fallujah. The boxes of medical supplies we brought in were torn open immediately by desperate doctors. A woman entered, slapping her chest and face, and wailing as her husband carried in the dying body of her little boy. Blood was trickling off one of his arms, which dangled out of his father's arms. Thus began my witnessing of an endless stream of women and children who had been shot by U.S. soldiers and were now being raced into the clinic, the cars speeding over the curb out front, and weeping family members carrying in their wounded. One 18-year-old girl had been shot through the neck. She was making breathy, gurgling noises as the doctors frantically worked on her amid her muffled moaning. Flies dodged the working hands of doctors to return to the patches of her vomit that stained her black abaya. Her younger brother, a small child of 10 with a gunshot wound in his head from a Marine sniper, his eyes glazed and staring into space, continually vomited as the doctors raced to save his life, while family members cried behind me. The Americans cut our electricity days ago, so we cannot vacuum the vomit from his throat, a furious doctor told me. They were both loaded into an ambulance and rushed toward Baghdad, only to die en route. Another small child lay on a blood-spattered bed, also shot by a sniper. His grandmother lay nearby, shot as she was attempting to carry children from their home and flee the city. She lay on a bed dying, still clutching a bloodied white surrender flag. Hundreds of families were trapped in their homes, terrorized by U.S. snipers shooting from rooftops and the minarets of mosques, whenever they saw someone move past a window. Blood bags were being kept in a food refrigerator, warmed under running water before being given to patients. There were no anesthetics. The lights went out as the generator ran dry of fuel, so the doctors, who had been working for days on end, worked by light provided by men holding up cigarette lighters or flashlights as the sun set. Needless to say, there was no air conditioning. One victim of the U.S. military aggression after another was brought in, nearly all of them women and children, carried by weeping family members. Those who had not been hit by bombs from warplanes had been shot by snipers. The one functioning ambulance left at this clinic sat outside with bullet holes in the sides and a small group of shots right on the driver's side of the windshield. The driver, his head bandaged from being grazed by the bullet of a sniper, refused to go collect any more of the dead and wounded. Standing near the ambulance in frustration, Maki told us, they shot the ambulance and they shot the driver after they checked his car, inspected his car, and knew that he was carrying nothing. Then they shot him, and then they shot the ambulance. And now I have no ambulance to evacuate more than 20 wounded people. I don't know who is doing this and why he is doing this. This is terrible. This has never happened before. And I don't know who to call because it seems that nobody is listening. That siege was followed about 6 months later by the November siege, which basically leveled the city. 75% of the entire city was either completely destroyed or damaged to the point of being unlivable. To this day, again, people would think, well, it's been so long, it's been 5 years almost, that something has been done. At least something must be a little bit better. The reality is, I was once again shocked to drive around in Fallujah and see that it's as though the siege had ended just a few weeks ago. There was almost no signs of reconstruction whatsoever. People in the city told me there was about 80% unemployment. Again, 1 to 2 hours of electricity per day. Nobody could trust drinking the water. The hospitals there in dire need of medical supplies. They're short of doctors, etc. And the city is basically languishing this long after that siege ended. And now I want to talk about why that's the case, because we've all heard of the corruption, the Bechtels, the Blackwaters, the Halliburtons, the $7 billion that went missing under the Coalition Provisional Authority the first year of the occupation. Now let's talk about a new phase that the corruption is kind of morphed into as this occupation kind of limps on through time and gets more corrupt and more complex, and the gray area widens, where we've all heard of these awakening groups that George Bush was set up under the Bush administration. This is basically a Sunni militia that what happened was the U.S. realized we are losing this fight against the resistance. It came out, it was well publicized that Don Rumsfeld, then Secretary of Defense, went into Iraq with no counterinsurgency strategy whatsoever. So by early 2006, at that point we're still losing about maybe 3 soldiers a day, about 10 times that number being wounded. It was very clear that the resistance was not being dampened down at all by anything that the Americans did, whether it's level Fallujah, using chemical weapons, using collective punishment, what have you. Nothing was working. Nothing was slowing it down. Everything seemed to be adding steam to it. So we've heard so much talk about the surge. The surge, February 2007, we're going to inject 30,000 troops. That's going to really bring down the violence. And most of the mainstream media in this country has bought that line. So they put in these troops, and yes, you have to admit violence is down. When in reality, the thing that dampened down the violence started to happen long before talk of the surge ever even entered into our dominant rhetoric in this country. If we go back to April 2006, there's a report came out by the think tank for the U.S. Army, which is called the RAND Corporation. It's been around for decades. They did reports like this during Vietnam. Well, RAND is alive and well, making lots of money as usual, and they are the think tank for the U.S. Army. They had a report that came out in April 2006. You can look all this up. It was very, very telling. And it basically said, look, Saddam Hussein also struggled to control these areas of Al-Anbar, the tribes, very volatile. These people don't like to be told what to do. So what did Saddam Hussein do to control these areas? He found tribal sheiks in charge of these big areas. He found those who were very corrupt and malleable and who would collaborate, and he started paying them. And he paid them lots and lots of money, and he said, you control your people. Whatever you need to do to make that happen is great. As long as you do that, I will keep funding you in the form of construction contracts. So fast forward a little bit, it's right around that time, it's mid-2006, it's summer 2006, the awakening groups start to be formed. And these basically are formed in exactly the same way that Saddam Hussein did it. The Americans found collaborating tribal sheikhs. Most of them were extremely corrupt. They had big smuggling rings. They ran organized crime, etc. And they started funneling billions of dollars of U.S. taxpayer money through these guys to funnel out into the people under their control, which actually were most of the resistance in Iraq. According to the U.S. military, this awakening group that the U.S. backed and ballooned into a 100,000 strong militia, they were all being paid $300 of U.S. taxpayer money a month. According to the U.S. military, most of them are former resistance fighters, and some of them, according to the U.S. military, are members of Al-Qaeda, all on the U.S. payroll to date as we speak. So these militias were formed. They basically took control of Al-Anbar province, and by the U.S. paying off the resistance to not attack them, guess what? Attacks went down, fewer Americans are being killed, it takes it out of the media, it's been very, very effective. So now what to do with these guys? So now here we are in early 2009, by the end of last year, theoretically these awakening groups, the U.S. disbanded them, and they were supposed to be rolled over into the Iraqi security forces. Well, the U.S. didn't disband them. Instead of paying them directly, now they have this rubric set up of, okay, all of these tribal sheikhs, these awakening leaders, are now in the construction business. So literally, I went and met with the head of the entire awakening movement for Iraq, Abu Risha, who had replaced his brother, who had been assassinated a week after he met with Bush. I digress. But anyway, the guy gives me his business card. Abu Risha, here's my phone number in Amman, here's my phone number in Dubai, here's my phone number in Iraq. Construction business. I actually spent the night with the head of the Awakening Council for Fallujah, a guy named Sheikh Afan. Same thing, here's my card, here's my Jordan number, here's my Dubai number, here's my Iraq number, here's my sat phone number, construction business. All these guys are in the construction business. So I want to talk about Sheikh Afan because I want to talk about Fallujah. And why is Fallujah still completely destroyed today? Here is this guy, born and raised in Saudi Arabia, came to Iraq in 2001. The invasion and occupation happened, and this guy's there, just so happens to position himself in the right place at the right time. The Americans are flailing around. He shows up and says, yes, I'm a tribal sheikh, I'm a leader here, I can bring people under control and I will work with you. So they start funneling money this guy's way, and at this point he has contracts worth over $250 million. And guess whose money that is? So this guy lives in a very big house on the outskirts of Fallujah. He has his own roughly 900 strong private militia of awakening group fighters. Most of them are former resistance fighters. He admits this. And this guy is basically a gangster. Let me tell you about this guy. So we had access to go in and interview him, and we went in, and we're under his security the entire time. And when I'm there, first of all, his place is heavily, heavily guarded. There's guards everywhere, there's guns everywhere. You walk into his office and there's 2 giant high caliber machine guns embanked right by his door. He's a little bit paranoid, and rightfully so, because someone just tried to knock him off about 3 days ago. But anyway, this guy to give you an idea where some of this money is going, since it's certainly not going into Fallujah and helping the people of Fallujah, this guy drives around in a $420,000 custom-made armored BMW. And we got to ride around in this very sweet ride. So he's driving, he has his walkie-talkie so we can be in constant contact with his security, which are, of course, in front and behind us in 2 SUVs full of armed guys. And then in this hand, he has his cell phone, which he's basically always on. He's talking to us and answering questions of me, a camera person, and our interpreter in the back seat. And then he has his satellite phone up here, and he's driving. So that gives you an idea. This guy's got a lot going on. He's a busy guy. And so we're driving around in Fallujah. It's a very surreal experience. And you look out the window, and here's just like building after building just bombed. Things are gutted. There's beggars on the streets. There's no infrastructure. The place is just hammered still. And here's this guy, this 34-year-old guy from Saudi Arabia driving around like the king of Fallujah in his $420,000 custom-made armored BMW. And he's just thinking he is basically the man. And so anyway, this is a guy who he is shamelessly, of course, has all of this money. It's increasing every single day. And when we're there, we go back to his place that evening and we're having dinner, and some Marines show up. He has regular visits from the U.S. Marines, and they come in, and I watch this guy sit up there with this Marine commander, and it's funny because if you were completely mute and couldn't understand a word of any language whatsoever, just watching the body language of these guys, I felt like I was watching 2 high school sophomores that had gotten in a fight and were brought into the principal's office and were like sitting there trying to act like they'd made up. They hated each other. They didn't trust each other. They looked very nervous and very uncomfortable. You could tell neither one of them wanted this to be happening, but this is what we have to go through. And basically, this is the Marines theoretically keeping tab on these awakening group leaders. There was probably also a money delivery being made. Most of you have probably heard of the pallets of shrink-wrapped bricks of $100 bills. That's how this operation works. Of course, Iraq is also a cash-only economy to this day. No credit cards, no traveler's checks, only cold hard cash. We'll take dollars or euros, preferably brand new crisp $100 bills. This guy literally walks around with a wad of these in his pocket, and I watched him just pull it out and peel one off and give it to his daughter and say, "Here you go, don't tell your mom where you got this." I mean, this is how this guy operates. So he has this interview with the Marines, and it's wrapping up, and I go back to the door. I see there's a Marine guarding the door, and they're getting ready to leave, and I go back to the guy, and I'm like, "So you guys do this very much?" He's like, "Yeah, this is what we do. We visit sheiks." And he saw me kind of look in at Sheikh Afan, and he looks back at me and he says, "Yeah, and this guy's like John Gotti." And so I wrote an article about it called Iraq's John Gotti, and I wish I had come up with it, but I have to attribute the Marine because it was absolutely perfect. This guy is a gangster, he's a collaborator, he's corrupt, and this is the type of person that the Americans are doing business with to keep a damper on the resistance for the moment. Earlier someone was asking me about, well, is the situation volatile? Is it a powder keg? Are there any things that could happen? I mean, just the structure of that, of what lengths the U.S. is going to for the moment to buy off the resistance and the people they're using to make this happen is a veritable powder keg in and of itself. There's others we can get into a little bit later. But it was amazing to me that here we are, the gall of this person and kind of the contrast of the city is completely destroyed. It's a microcosm analogy of the entire situation of Iraq, totally destroyed. And then here's this guy, seemingly with no conscience, richer than he's ever could have dreamed his entire life, and getting more rich by the day. And again, it's the average person on the ground that's paying the price for it, whether it's us funding it with our tax dollars or the Iraqi people having to just try to survive it. But again, this is nothing new. It's not a unique thing to the U.S. empire. It happens with all empires. I like to read a quote from Roman historian Cornelius Tacitus, who wrote about imperial Rome. Quote, "They have plundered the world, stripping naked the land in their hunger. They are driven by greed if their enemy be rich, by ambition if poor. They ravage, they slaughter, they seize by false pretenses. And all of this they hail as the construction of empire. And when in their wake nothing remains but a desert, they call that peace." I want to leave plenty of time for questions and answers, and so I'll wrap this up soon. A few thoughts to leave you with. A rhetorical question that I think it's always important for us to ponder, and certainly one that we can all take home tonight, is not the depth of our dignity determined by how we treat those in need, whoever they may be? Is not the depth of our dignity determined by how we treat those in need? And I also get asked a lot, what can we do? What should we do? And we can talk about that a little bit more, but there's so many great organizations here tonight, the sponsors for starters, and there's probably others here, and people ask, what can we do? What can we do? And for sure, and again, history shows us this as well, that getting involved individually is critical, but if you really want to be effective, getting involved with other groups who are doing similar things is even much more effective. And in that spirit, I'd like to read a poem by poet and author Marge Piercy called "The Low Road." What can they do to you? Whatever they want. They can set you up. They can bust you. They can break your fingers. They can burn your brain with electricity, blur you with drugs till you can't walk, can't remember. They can take your child, wall up your lover. They can do anything you can't stop them from doing. How can you stop them? Alone you can fight, you can refuse, you can take what revenge you can, but they roll over you. But two people fighting back to back can cut through a mob. A snake dancing file can break a cordon. An army can meet an army. Two people can keep each other sane, can give support, conviction, love, massage, hope, sex. Three people are a delegation, a committee, a wedge. With four, you can play bridge and start an organization. With six, you can rent a whole house, eat pie for dinner with no seconds, and hold a fundraising party. A dozen make a demonstration, 100 fill a hall, 1,000 have solidarity in your own newsletter, 10,000 power in your own paper, 100,000 your own media, 10 million your own country. It goes on one at a time. It starts when you care to act. It starts when you do it again after they said no. It starts when you say we and know who you mean, and each day you mean one more. And finally, I like, again, people have often asked, what can I do? What should I do? And I want to read another quote from the painter Mark Rothko. "This world of the imagination is fancy-free and violently opposed to common sense." And I think now is a very, very good time when we ponder what to do amidst two ongoing occupations that our country is directly involved in, and another that they're less directly involved in, and an economic meltdown of proportions that I think most of us still really have yet to grasp, and against the staggering backdrop of global climate change. I just saw an article that I'd seen before, but an update on it that, for example, by 2013, many scientists believe there will be no ice on the North Pole in the summer. So there's that to ponder as well. My point is, I can't think of a time when we try to figure out what to do or how to be most effective, we remember the words of Rothko. This world of the imagination is fancy-free and violently opposed to common sense. I think we've had enough common sense to last us quite a while. Again, I think the final thought that I'd like to leave you with is that whatever it is that we decide to do to make the world a better place, whether it's working to end the occupations, getting involved in work to educate people and prevent further climate change, or whether it's doing art or writing or whatever it is that we decide to do, I think it's critical that each one of us dedicate ourselves with all of our heart and spirit towards working to care for whatever it is, that precious thing that we decide deserves our attention at this time. And we need to do it more than ever with all of our heart and spirit and redouble our efforts despite how grim things might be looking overall. If nothing else, because it definitely does bring us joy, and also because it's simply the right thing to do. So thanks everyone very much for coming out tonight. Thank you very much.